They went to the bottom of the Mariana Trench and saw something move where almost nothing should survive. It was January 23, 1960, when Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh descended inside the Trieste toward Challenger Deep, nearly 11,000 meters below the surface. Before we go ahead and tell you what they found when they entered the bottom, and whether it was really alive, we want you to see these images. The images that you saw are only the beginning of what's about to be revealed in the video later. Stay tuned. No sunlight reached them. No human body could survive outside the craft. The pressure was strong enough to crush almost anything from the world above. But when the sub touched the seafloor, the deepest place on Earth did not look completely still. Piccard later described something alive moving across the ooze, disappearing into the black water as if it belonged there. For years, that single sighting has left scientists with a problem. If it was not human, and if a fish should not live that deep, what was moving at the bottom of the Mariana Trench? The only witnesses. Fewer people have reached the bottom of Challenger Deep than have walked on the moon. That one fact makes the Mariana Trench different from almost every other place on Earth. This is not a place full of witnesses, cameras, or casual explorers. At the very bottom, almost everything we know began with the few people who survived the trip down and came back to describe it. Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh became the first humans to reach that point on January 23, 1960, inside the bathyscaphe Trieste. Their dive was not legend. It was a real mission, with real names, a real date, and a real machine built to survive, a place almost no vessel could enter. That matters, because the mystery does not begin with a rumor. It begins with two men inside a steel sphere at the deepest known point in the ocean, nearly 11,000 meters below the surface. The water above them pressed down with force almost impossible to imagine. At that depth, pressure is measured in tons per square inch. The outside world was black, freezing, and lethal. One weakness in the craft could have ended the dive before either man had time to understand what went wrong. Inside that lethal dark, the first crew reported something that still refuses to sit quietly in the record. They said they saw something alive moving across the seafloor, not floating above them, not caught in the water column. Moving on the bottom, where many scientists later argued, a fish should not have been able to live. This is not a monster account. It is a documented observation that, if taken at face value, pushes against the known limits of life. That is why the sighting still matters more than 60 years later. The question is simple, but it changes everything. What exactly did they see moving down there? To understand why one short visit still divides scientists, you have to go back to the moment the Trieste touched the bottom. 20 minutes on the bottom. 5 hours of descent carried the Trieste through darkness toward a place no human had ever reached before. Piccard and Walsh were not looking out over a clear ocean floor like explorers in sunlight. They were falling through pressure, silence, and black water, sealed inside a small sphere while the deepest trench on Earth slowly rose up beneath them. Landing did not give them a clean view. When the Trieste settled on the bottom, it stirred up fine sediment from the seafloor. That cloud drifted around the viewport and turned their only window into something closer to fog. The men had reached the most remote place on Earth, but the place itself was partly hidden from them the moment they arrived. Piccard later described seeing a flatfish about a foot long and roughly half as wide, something resembling a sole, with two round eyes on top of its head. That detail is the center of the mystery. He did not describe a vague shape or a quick flash. He described a body, a size, a position, and eyes looking upward from the bottom. Movement made the observation impossible to ignore. The animal was said to lie in the ooze, then slowly swim away across the seafloor before disappearing into the black. Without that movement, the sighting might have been dismissed as debris, shadow, or a trick of the stirred-up mud. But Piccard said it moved like a living thing that belonged there. Only about 20 minutes were spent on the bottom. No biologist was inside the craft. The window was clouded. The observation came under some of the worst viewing conditions imaginable. Yet that short, imperfect moment became one of the most contested sightings in deep-sea science. Was it written down clearly, or did it grow later into legend? The reason this sighting survived is that Piccard did not only speak about it, he put it in print, in his own words, for the world to read. The words that survived Piccard's printed account is the reason this sighting never stayed as a loose rumor. In August 1960, National Geographic published his description of the Trieste dive, putting the observation into the public record as something reported by a real expedition. That matters, because the mystery does not depend only on later retellings. It begins with the words of one of the men who was actually inside the craft. In that account, Piccard described the animal moving partly through the ooze before disappearing into the black night of the trench. That wording gave the moment a strange power. He did not describe a quick shadow or a shape he could not place. He described something that seemed to belong to the bottom, moving away through a darkness no human had ever entered before. Confidence made the observation harder to ignore. Piccard described a flatfish-like animal, about a foot long and half as wide, with eyes on top of its head. Those are not vague details. They sound like identification. They give the viewer size, shape, posture, and movement. That is why the sighting became more than a strange line in a dive account. At the time, the sighting carried huge weight. If a fish really lived at the bottom of Challenger Deep, then vertebrate life had reached the deepest point in the ocean. For many people, that made the Trieste dive more than a record-setting descent. It became proof that life with a backbone could exist where almost nothing familiar should survive. Later, the same details that made the account famous made it vulnerable. A confident description is powerful, but it also gives scientists something to test. If Piccard saw a real flatfish, then biology had a serious problem to explain. If he did not, then one of the most famous observations in deep-sea history had been misunderstood from the start. If it was written down so clearly, why would anyone doubt it? The answer begins with what one fish would mean for science. Why one fish rewrites the rules. One fish at nearly 11,000 meters is not a small detail. It would push the known reach of vertebrate life thousands of meters deeper than anything science has been able to confirm. That is why the Trieste sighting still matters. It is not just about a shape moving in the dark. It is about whether the deepest point on Earth can hold life that breaks the rules. A vertebrate is not like a drifting organism or a soft-bodied scavenger. A fish has organs, muscles, bones, fluids, and chemistry that must keep working under crushing pressure. At the bottom of Challenger Deep, those systems face conditions far beyond ordinary deep-sea life. If Piccard truly saw a flatfish there, then the known boundary for animals with backbones would have to move. This connects directly to the title's mystery. The question is not simply what was moving. The question is whether the movement belonged to something science says should not be there. A blob, a sea cucumber, a shrimp-like animal, or stirred-up debris would mean one thing. A fish would mean something much larger. It would mean the trench was hiding a form of life past the expected limit. Identity matters because every possible answer changes the case. If it was a fish, the observation rewrites biology. If it was an invertebrate, then Piccard may have honestly misread something in poor visibility. If it was sediment or shadow, then the deepest fish account collapses into a human mistake made under extreme conditions. That is why the sighting never died. It sits on the line between known life and impossible life. Piccard's words gave the world a moving animal at the bottom of the sea, but science had to ask a harder question. What does that depth actually do to a living body? To judge whether a fish could really survive there, you first have to understand the zone where things are not supposed to live. The zone where things shouldn't live. Below about 6,000 meters, the ocean enters the Hadal zone. Challenger Deep sits near the very floor of that world, close to 11,000 meters below the surface. At that depth, the ocean is no longer just deep. It becomes a place where pressure, darkness, cold, and distance work against almost every normal rule of life. Challenger Deep is locked in permanent darkness. Sunlight never reaches it. The water stays barely above freezing, usually around 1 to 4 degrees Celsius, and food does not grow there in any normal way. Most of what arrives comes from far above: dead animals, waste, and tiny pieces of organic matter slowly sinking through miles of black water. Energy shapes everything down there. With so little food coming in, large active animals are exactly the kind of life you would least expect to find. Small scavengers can survive by waiting. Soft-bodied animals can move slowly and use less energy. But a foot-long fish lying on the bottom and swimming away would be something different. It would mean a vertebrate was living where biology gives it almost no room. Modern tools make the old sighting even harder to judge. In 1960, Piccard and Walsh had a clouded viewport and their own eyes. They did not have high-definition cameras, robotic landers, or repeat footage from multiple angles. The observation came during one short visit, through disturbed sediment, inside the weakest viewing setup ever used at the bottom of the trench. This is why the moving animal matters. A shape at that depth would be strange. A living, foot-long animal would be stranger. A fish would be the real problem. It would not be a routine deep-sea sighting. It would be an anomaly at the edge of known life. So how does modern science test a 60-year-old sighting that no one can replay? You cannot go back to 1960 and look again. So researchers found another way to put Piccard's fish on trial. Putting the sighting on trial, scientists could not return to Piccard's exact moment. So they tested the sighting from the outside. They compared it against fish biology, later deep-sea footage, and the physics of extreme depth. That method matters because it does not depend on calling Piccard wrong from the start. It asks whether his description can survive what science later learned. Fish have a pressure problem at extreme depth. Their cells rely on protective compounds called osmolytes, including TMAO, to keep proteins working under pressure. But there is a limit. Research suggests that beyond roughly 8,000 to 8,500 meters, fish chemistry runs out of room to adjust. Past that point, the pressure becomes too much for the systems a fish needs to stay alive. A 2012 peer-reviewed paper re-examined the Trieste flatfish sighting directly. It did not treat the account as a monster tale. It treated it as an observation that could be tested. The conclusion was careful, but firm. The flatfish was most likely a misidentification, or the sighting itself was simply wrong under the conditions in which it was made. Later dives made the problem stronger. Robotic missions and deep-sea vehicles returned to Hadal depths with better cameras and better tools, but no comparable fish appeared at Challenger Deep. That absence does not prove what Piccard saw in one instant. But when the depth is beyond the known fish limit, the viewport was clouded, and later surveys find no match, the doubt becomes serious. Fair testing does not require Piccard to be dishonest. He may have reported exactly what he believed he saw, but an eyewitness view through sediment, pressure glass, and a few minutes of darkness is not the same as biological proof. The evidence settles one part clearly: a true fish at nearly 11,000 meters would break known limits. The harder question is what Piccard actually saw moving there. When the evidence is lined up, it closes one door, but it leaves the movement itself harder to explain. Not a fish, but still something. Evidence now points to one clear answer. Whatever Piccard saw at the bottom of Challenger Deep was almost certainly not a fish. The trench floor sits near 11,000 meters, far below the level where fish are believed to survive. That does not make the sighting meaningless. It makes it stranger because the movement still has to be explained. Deepest confirmed fish records stop much higher. The deepest fish ever filmed was recorded at 8,336 meters, and researchers think the real limit for fish is close to 8,400 meters. Challenger Deep lies roughly 2,500 meters below that boundary, so a flatfish living there would not just be rare, it would be far beyond the known edge of vertebrate life. James Cameron's 2012 return made the gap harder to ignore. When he reached the bottom, he described a barren lunar plain. He said he did not see a fish or anything that looked alive to him, except a few small amphipods in the water. This mattered because Cameron arrived with better equipment, better lighting, and a modern understanding of what to look for. None of this proves Piccard saw nothing. It only removes the strongest old interpretation. A fish is almost impossible to defend now, but motion itself is not. Small animals do live and move in the deepest trenches. Cameron's own observation of amphipods confirms that the bottom is not completely dead. Life is there, just not in the form Piccard first believed. Piccard's sighting now lands in a different place. What was moving was not human. It was probably not a fish, but it may have been one of the strange non-vertebrate animals built for the deepest ocean. That leaves the real question. If it was not a fish, what living thing was crossing the ooze? Ruling out a fish does not close the case. It forces the investigation toward the stranger life that actually moves down there. The things that actually move down there. Real candidates exist in the deep, and some are stranger than a fish. Xenophiophores can grow to saucer size even though they are single-celled organisms. Sea cucumbers, also called holothurians, have been seen at extreme depths. Supergiant amphipods can reach about 30 centimeters, almost the same foot-long size Piccard described. These are not familiar animals, but they belong to that world. Torben Wolff offered one of the most grounded explanations. He argued that Piccard may have seen an eyeless sea cucumber instead of a flatfish. In poor visibility, a flattened invertebrate lying on the bottom could be mistaken for something fish-like, especially by someone who was not trained to identify deep-sea animals. The mistake would be understandable, not dishonest. Don Walsh later made the account more complicated. He admitted the identification could have been wrong, because neither he nor Piccard had deep biological training. That matters because the sighting had been treated for years as if two witnesses had confirmed a fish. But one of those witnesses later allowed for a much less certain answer. Two eyewitness accounts also did not carry the same confidence. Piccard gave the stronger fish description, while Walsh remembered the sediment cloud and the poor viewing conditions more heavily. The Trieste had stirred the bottom when it landed, and the viewport was never a perfect window into the trench. Even at the scene itself, certainty was limited. Decades of robotic dives have not filmed anything like Piccard's flatfish again. That is the part that keeps the case open. Science has strong candidates, sea cucumbers, amphipods, and other deep invertebrates. But no camera has caught the exact creature he described. The most honest explanation is that something probably moved, but the name attached to it was wrong. When the physics, the witnesses, and the real deep-sea animals are put together, one grounded version finally begins to form, but it still does not tie every thread. The most honest explanation. Most likely, Piccard and Walsh saw something real. They were not trained biologists. They had only about 20 minutes on the bottom, and they were looking through a viewport partly clouded by sediment. Under those conditions, a moving hadal animal could easily be read as a flatfish. The mistake would not be strange. The strange part is where it happened, nearly 11,000 meters down, on the deepest floor on Earth. A gelatinous sea cucumber is one of the strongest possibilities. It could lie low on the ooze, shift slowly, and look flattened through poor visibility. A supergiant amphipod is another serious candidate because some can reach close to a foot long, matching the size Piccard described far better than any fish could. These animals do not look familiar. In a fogged window, under pressure, in total darkness, they could become almost impossible to name. No later dive has confirmed exactly what Piccard saw. That keeps the identity genuinely unresolved. Science can rule out the flatfish idea with confidence, but it cannot rewind that one moment in 1960. No camera captured the animal. No sample was taken. No second look happened before the sediment, darkness, and time swallowed the sighting. Real hadal animals already look alien to human eyes. Snailfish, amphipods, sea cucumbers, and deep single-celled giants can appear translucent, soft, ghost-like, or barely formed. So the title's promise is not fake. What was moving was not human. It was almost certainly not a fish. But it may have been a real creature from a world so extreme that even familiar life becomes hard to recognize. The strongest explanation is not a sea monster, and it is not a rule-breaking fish. It is a real, strange, unnamed in that moment animal crossing the ooze while the first humans at the bottom of the world tried to understand what they were seeing. If even the most realistic answer cannot name it exactly, then one question remains. The mystery no longer asks whether a fish survived down there. It asks what else is still moving in a place we have barely seen. What's still moving down there? More than 60 years after the Trieste touched the bottom, the first moving thing reported at Challenger Deep still has no certain name. The fish explanation has weakened. The human explanation never made sense. But the movement itself remains part of the account. Two men reached the deepest known point in the ocean, looked out through the dark, and believed they had seen life moving across the floor. One half of the mystery is clearer now. It was almost certainly not a fish, because confirmed fish records stop thousands of meters above that floor. It was not human, because nothing human could exist outside that craft for even a moment. But the exact thing Piccard saw has never been filmed again in the same form. That leaves the most important part unresolved. Not whether life exists there, but what kind of life he was actually looking at. Only a handful of human dives have ever reached that world, and even robotic visits have seen only tiny pieces of it. Challenger Deep is not a wide-open stage under bright lights. It is a dark, cold, pressurized landscape where cameras see only what passes through a small cone of light. Vast stretches of the trench floor remain unseen by human eyes or machines. Life absolutely exists down there. Microbes live in the sediment. Amphipods move through the darkness. Strange, soft-bodied animals survive where pressure would crush almost anything from the surface. That means unclassified or rarely seen moving life at the bottom is not fantasy. It is exactly what a place that hidden should be expected to hold. The Trieste sighting may never be solved cleanly, but it still matters because it was the first human glimpse into a world that barely allows witnesses. Piccard may have named the animal wrong, but he may not have been wrong that something moved. And if the first thing humans saw at the bottom of the world is still unidentified, what else is moving down there that we have not met yet? The deepest place on Earth has already shown us life. The real mystery is how much of it is still outside the light. The bottom of the Mariana Trench does not give up answers easily. It gave Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh only a few minutes, one clouded window, and one impossible-looking movement across the ooze. That was enough to create a question that has lasted for more than 60 years. Today, science can say what it probably was not. It was not human. Nothing human could survive outside the Trieste at nearly 11,000 meters. It was almost certainly not a fish either, because the pressure at Challenger Deep pushes far beyond the known limit for vertebrate life. But removing those answers does not erase the sighting. It only makes the remaining questions stranger. Something down there moved. Maybe it was a sea cucumber, maybe it was a supergiant amphipod, maybe it was another deep animal the two men could not recognize through the stirred-up sediment and black water. The most honest explanation is not a monster and not a miracle fish. It is something quieter, colder, and more unsettling. A real living thing from a world humans had barely entered. That is why the sighting still matters. The mystery is not only about one animal seen in 1960. It is about how little of the deepest place on Earth has ever been watched clearly. Cameras have improved, submersibles have returned, robots have gone where humans cannot stay. And still, vast parts of that floor remain unseen. The first humans to reach the bottom looked out and believed something alive was moving there. More than half a century later, no one can name it with certainty. And until the trench floor is fully seen, the deepest dark on Earth will keep one question open. What else is moving down there just outside the light?